Hey guys, Scott Jensen with Charlotte Stories here. So the election coming up and a lot of rhetoric about political violence and instability. Ran into Jennifer Roberts, the former mayor of Charlotte, and she invited me to an event at the City Club with Crimmins and Hadia Mubarak. They talked about his trip they recently took to Northern Ireland to learn about a lot of the political violence and the instability there. So I wanted to just talk with them and see kind of what we could do in Charlotte to potentially avoid any conflict, political violence, anything, if there is a contested election coming up. So, yeah, Casey?
So I'm Crimmins. I lead a network of networks of churches and pastors, Christian nonprofit leaders and marketplace folks called For Charlotte. It is a table that we set for Christians across the city to connect, learn, take action together to affect the needs of the city. So that's what I get to do. So I spend a lot of time with pastors, leaders, Christian folks in the city.
And then I also ran into Hadia Mubarak.
Thanks for having me on the show. I'm Hadia Mubarak. I teach at Queen's University of Charlotte. I'm associate professor of religion. I grew up in the Panhandle, just FYI, and I did my PhD at Georgetown University. Moved here in 2015, taught at UNCC and at Davidson College, and then at Guilford College for 2 years before joining Queen's in fall 2020. I'm also a scholar fellow at the Muslim Community Center of Charlotte. It's one of the larger mosques in the university area of Johnson Oler. I'm also on the board of, on the education council of one of the private Muslim schools, K-12 Muslim schools in Charlotte.
I remember Jennifer Roberts said she invited both of you to this trip. So talk about maybe what you thought of each other before the trip, during the trip, and after. Because you're not really great friends, right?
No, in fact, we had never met before. So we were perfect strangers. And our first encounter was kind of funny.
So we had to wait 6 hours in the airport for all the other members of the delegation to come so we can go together from Dublin to Belfast. And there were 25, we were a 25-member delegation from six swing states. And so I was like, I'm sleeping. I'm going to crash right here on these chairs. And Casey was like, I looked over you to make sure you weren't getting kidnapped. And so that was the story.
About every 15 minutes, I'd alarm go off. I was like, is she still there? Okay, perfect. You just never know, man. So, you know, Dublin's a rough place. It's true.
Yeah. So, well, I appreciate because I had my stuff sprawled all over. They're like, don't worry, Casey's on guard duty, you know. And but it was nice. We all really bonded and connected and felt like friends by the end of that short trip.
Yeah, and it's been fun coming back because we go for 7 days to a country I've never been to cities we've never been to. We have all kind of these first experiences all together, obviously very galvanizing, bonding over, hey, we would love to see our country stay a democracy.
Yeah.
And not devolve into political violence and civil war. I mean, that was a lot of the talk. I don't know if people remember, early 2024, the phrase civil war was coming up more in Google searches and kind of out there in the public space way more than it's ever been. And obviously that's a little disconcerting. And so to go to a place that actually experienced that, but not in the way of, 1600s, 15, not like, oh, let's march on out and take fire, gunshot with our muskets. It's guerrilla warfare. So to go to Northern Ireland and really be literally on the streets and in the places and spaces where they experienced that was very powerful.
Did you, from your experience there, did you see any maybe similar buildups to what happened there, correlated to maybe some of the shootings we've seen in America and some of the, violence and threats and bullying? What did you take away from that?
I mean, I would say that, we learned our emphasis was on what ended the troubles, a 30-year period of fighting and violence. And nearly everyone we met had lost someone that they knew, that they loved. We began to realize how arbitrary the violence had become because it just created the cycle of vengeance. And each group, the Irish Republicans and the Loyalists and Unionists, they just wanted revenge at a certain point because there was, the thing about the violence that we learned is that there's a certain illogic to violence, even when each side has your legitimate grievances and each side has their, what you can call strategic objectives to what they're pursuing. But it came at a really, really high cost with, nearly 3,600 deaths and for such a small population. And they all, and even people who were very adamantly, we met this one high-ranking Republican, Sean Murray, who had been part of Sinn Féin and still is part of Sinn Féin, and just talked about the cost of violence and that there's no alternative to engagement. So like how long is this going to continue? Because it can continue as long as people will allow it to. It can continue perpetually. So there has to be the political will to say it's just not worth it.
I think to your question of like what, and feel free to chime in if I miss pieces, but I think there is almost like when Brad Panovich from Charlotte talks about the difference between a tornado watch and a tornado warning. Or like one is like, it's happening, and the other is like, the ingredients are there, but they're not together yet, so just like be on your guard. And I think we, while over there, are gathering a bit of the background of what it took to get to that level a bit. I mean, it's unbelievably complex, and no one has the entirety of the story, but there's like key ingredients that they were sharing that I was like, some of these ingredients seem to be on the table. So things like media that is perpetuating mis and disinformation, and understanding the difference between them. So misinformation is like, I've said something, oh, it's wrong, but let me come back to it, and I did that by accident. And the disinformation was, I'm gonna say something that I know for sure is not true, and just keep that thing going. And how that, especially into ears of those that trust those news anchors, outlets, channels, like what that can do. And then also mis and disinformation, like inside of the tribal groups, whether it was the loyalist or Republicans, like, and I'll never forget this, that one of the women that was talking, I believe she was Irish Republican, talking about, or no, it was a loyalist that said, we were told when we were younger that I could tell a Catholic based on how far apart their eyes were.
Wow.
And I just remember sitting there going, that's ludicrous. Like, why would you? And it's like, but if that's the information you're receiving, then you can. And if it's taken in and trusted, that's fine. Mistrust in the democratic system, and the dehumanization of other, like that to me is that like special horrible sauce that when that starts to become more and more and more prevalent, that you can so easily other and almost disassociate the humanity of another because of whatever. Like, I can't, that person's evil, pure evil. When you start hearing rhetoric like that, it starts to become easy to go, well, then if they're just pure evil, they're not humans.
Yeah.
So when you start to see those things start to align, and I just third party looking in, I look around and go, I see some of that going on. That's disconcerting.
Yeah, which is huge that you both developed a friendship over there, because I mean, Casey, you represent hundreds. No, I don't know represent, but you work with hundreds of evangelical churches here in Charlotte.
Yeah.
And now a lot of the rhetoric, obviously, people are having labels. And Hadia, you represent countless Muslim communities here in Charlotte, probably all of them, because that's more of a smaller dynamic here in the South for sure. So I can imagine it would be easy for both of you to just see each other as a label, see him as an evangelical, or Casey, see Hadia as a Muslim, with all the stereotypes that go with those identities. But when you go there learning about these political violence, you learn that you're Hadia Casey, not these labels. What kind of forgiveness did you see? What kind of swallowing the anger did you see happening?
Yeah. Well, I just want to reiterate what Casey just said also in terms of the rhetoric of dehumanization and this unchecked hate, right? We saw that when hatred is allowed to go unchecked, what that leads to. I remember, I think one of the most powerful experiences we witnessed, and I'll say we were all in some ways bearing witness to the stories of this young woman who lost her maybe like 17-year-old son. And side by side, a man who lost his wife to the violence from opposite sides, opposite ends. And the fact that, they both died for something so futile, in the sense that the people who killed them didn't even know why they're targeting them, other than that this person fits this identity or fits this label.
So you just said unchecked hate, and that kind of just hit me. That was one of the major issues you saw. So how do we check hate?
Well, let me back up to something, because I think it's worth, when you talk about the solution, and I think as Hadia just said, they didn't get like a great solution. They got a ceasefire. They got people to stop killing each other. And then for the last 25 years, trying to walk out what solution actually looks like. Because, I mean, we sat with four out of the five leaders, or four out of the five parties represented at a table that now represents their government, which is unbelievably complex. Like, we sat there for 2 hours and I had 50 more questions. It's just like, wait, how does this work again? Like, we have two,
Yeah, we only
three.
we only have two parties
They have
here.
five, and every single one plays a critical part in each of the movings. Like, even if you get a majority, the most minority party gets a seat at the head of a certain table to check the power of, like, it was very complex. So to sit with that level of complexity requires a level of pain from before to go, well, we can never go back there. I think that's my probably biggest concern, is that we haven't experienced the highest level of pain yet. And the hope is that there's enough coalition building to say, we don't want that.
Yeah.
Like, we can point to no less than half a dozen societal things going on the planet right now that are divisive division wars, where people are killing each other over division, and we just don't want that. So can we agree to that and then go, how do we then walk out whatever needs to be walked out?
Yeah.
So I did want to mention that, but to the question of how do we check hate, how do we call to account those that are using either words, verbiage, rhetoric, ongoing things. I think that is some of what the church, if I'm not representing, but as a one representative, like that's our deal. Like, that's kind of what we should be doing.
Yeah.
Is speaking in that truth, but choosing when and how to do it in a way that, like, would honor Christ, but also then honor the people that are there. This is where it gets dicey.
Last October, right after the horrific attacks of October 7th, a man drove by my son and I and rolled out his window and called us terrorists. And for my son, it was one of the first times he had experienced something like that. He was 15 at the time. And he was just so shocked that someone who doesn't even know us would accuse us of something so dehumanizing, right? Because if you're calling someone a terrorist, which is, by the way, those are the jokes that my son is hearing in school, right? You're basically telling that person you are inherently violent, you are inherently evil.
Yeah.
So it's so dehumanizing. And I will say my daughter attends a private Muslim school. And just last week, I received an email. My heart stopped when I read it, related to campus security, that there was a stranger on campus talking to the young girls, asking them questions. In fact, these girls are in my daughter's class, but she happened to be somewhere else at the time, and even asking them to get into his car. So I'm very concerned. I'm very concerned about, God forbid, political violence, but also, the fact that, young people, schools, mosques, places of worship can be the targets. I do want to mention something about what you said with unchecked hate and how do we curb this. I think there's an individual responsibility and a collective responsibility. On an individual level, I would say we have to go back to the spiritual well springs of our faith traditions, whatever they are. And in my tradition as a Muslim, we believe that God wants us to purify our hearts, right? To get rid of the vices that brings down humanity, whether it's jealousy, hatred, rancor, vengeance. All of these things are things that muddy our hearts. And that's on a very individual level, that we have to be introspective to say, I really, truly love my neighbor, irrespective of who they are. And I think people of all faiths can do this from their own spiritual wellspring, whatever that is, right? If they're Buddhist or Hindu or Christian or Jewish. But on a collective level, we have a responsibility to stand up against hate. And whoever's doing the hateful rhetoric and whoever they're doing it against, because it's so easy for us as human beings to compartmentalize people and to say, all X people are like this or think like this. And it's such a reductionist way of thinking, and it's so inaccurate. And we have a responsibility to counter that and say, that's not true. Where are you getting this information from? Racism no one's immune from racism, right? That's something that's very powerful about the book by Ibram X. Kendi, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is that no one's immune from racism. And we all have our biases, and we have to begin with actually becoming aware of our own biases. What are those biases? Where did they come from? And then to make the decision to be an anti-racist is what he says, but to be someone who's really, again, for the freedom of all people, for justice for all people, for human rights for all people. And again, being very, very careful about rhetoric that dehumanizes and therefore legitimizes violence against others.
Yeah, and I would even say dehumanizing the other camp. So if you're in the Trump camp, dehumanizing those who are supporters of Harris, and if you're in the Harris camp, dehumanizing those who are in the Trump camp.
Yes. To remember that we all have a lot more similarities and differences, that we all ultimately want the same thing. We want a safe, peaceful, thriving America for our children, for our grandchildren, that we want, good jobs, we want good education, that they're at the end, there's so much more that unifies us as Americans, irrespective of our faiths and backgrounds and races, than there is that divides us. And I think that's what we need to amplify.
That's beautiful. Well, a thought that came to mind, as you guys are now good friends, Casey, why don't you say something positive you learned about Hadia, and Hadia, why don't you say something positive you learned about Casey? If you could think of any.
Absolutely. I'll go first. It's been amazing to see just the compassionate heart that Hadia's had through whatever context we've been in. I just feel like God has given her a lot of compassion for people that are hurting. Like, whether we talk about folks in the Gaza Strip and in the middle of that Israeli-Palestine conflict, whether it's Americans, black, white, Muslim, Asian, like just to see the other. I feel like she's like a warrior and champion for the other, and I've really, really appreciated that about her.
No.
Well, there's a lot to say about Casey. I will say, though, he puts his faith into action, and I really respect that. So we went to a restaurant on one night when our event was canceled because of a tornado warning or hurricane or one of those back in August, and we decided to meet up for dinner, and I found Casey on the floor cleaning up the floor of the restaurant. I'm like, what are you doing, Casey? And he reminded me that Jesus was a servant, and he was a servant of the people, I believe is what you had mentioned. And I just feel like, there are a lot of people who preach the word, but few people who actually implement it. And as someone who takes my faith seriously, I love it when I can see the beauty of other faith traditions exemplified in their character and their behavior.
That's amazing. Well, thank you guys for joining us. Thank you everybody in Charlotte for watching. And as I just want to reiterate, the election's coming up. Please reach out to other communities you may not have known, communities you may fear. Learn, talk, discuss, and hopefully we will have a peaceful election and a peaceful transition on whatever that looks like. So thank you guys again, and have a good day.
Thanks so much.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks for having us.